White text over video of past events. Logo, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. Professional Development Series presents Open Book Conversation with Emily Ladau and Risa Rifkind. Colorful text on a white background. CCAC Fundraiser 2021. An open book conversation. 2 headshots alongside the speakers' names, Emily Ladau and Risa Jazz Rifkind. Next, split screen view showing speaker at left and at right and ASL interpreter signs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to an open book conversation presented by CCAC. My name is Clare Killy. I'm one of the co-chairs here at CCAC. I use she, her pronouns, and I'd like to provide a visual description by letting you know that I'm a white woman with dark brown, long hair. I'm wearing a black shirt today with a blazer over it that's orange, white, and gray plaid, and I am in front of a blurred background. I'm joined today by my fellow co-chairs, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today to raise funds for CCAC. We are so thrilled to have special guests and disability rights activists Emily Ladau and Risa Jazz Rifkind to join us today.
Speaker view changes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Kosner, and I am also a co-chair of CCAC. My pronouns are she, her, and a visual description of myself is I'm a 30-something white woman with shoulder-length, curly brown hair, and I am against the background of my dining room, which is blurry because it's kind of messy. For those of you not familiar with CCAC, our mission is to empower Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. We do this through 4 primary means. Those include free professional development workshops, an accessible equipment loan program, an accessible event calendar, and our recently launched statewide consortium, the Illinois Cultural Accessibility Consortium, otherwise known as ICANN.
Speaker view changes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Pearson, and I'm also a co-chair of CCAC. Visual description, I am a white 30-something woman wearing headphones, wearing a gray sweater over a blue and white striped dress, sitting in my office. Accessibility is a priority for us, and our program today includes real-time captioning provided by Efficiency Reporting, as well as ASL interpretation provided by AI Media. We also have the Q&A feature enabled, and we encourage you to utilize that feature to submit questions for the live Q&A that will happen towards the end of the event. If you have any issues with accessibility, please don't hesitate to reach out to our support team using the chat function. And now we'd like to welcome the founder and president of CCAC, Christina Gunther, for some opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hillary, Anna, and Claire. My name is Christina, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a 30-something white woman wearing red glasses. I have dark hair pulled down, and I'm wearing a brown sweater, and I have a background with a plant that I strategically placed by my head. I want to thank you so much for attending today. Supporters like you allow CCAC to provide free programs and resources. Today's featured conversation is one example of the type of programming CCAC is committed to: engaging and informative content that centers the disability community and empowers cultural institutions to be inclusive for visitors with disabilities. We want to take this time also to acknowledge our funders that have provided support to CCAC, including the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, the PERT Foundation, the Michael and Mona Heath Fund, Illinois Arts Council Agency through federal funds provided by the National Endowment for the Arts, and individual donors like you. As an entirely volunteer-run organization, there's so many people who have and continue to dedicate passion, knowledge, and their time to CCAC, including our past and current steering committee members and co-chairs. I'd like to recognize them for their dedication and commitment. You can view a full list of past and current members via the link in the chat, and please do, because it's many people that we want to thank. Later on in the program, we're excited to share more about CCAC's impact and how the funds we raise make everything possible. But I'd also like you to know that your support contributes to our organizational progress towards key strategic goals and areas that we've identified and we want to grow. including ICANN, the Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network, a statewide consortium initiated by CCAC. Another goal is to prioritize diversity, equity, access, and inclusion across all aspects of our organization, internally and externally. We also aim to establish CCAC as a leading source of expertise in the field of cultural accessibility. And finally, to continue to refine and expand our professional development programs, our equipment loan program, and our access calendar. And then finally, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, COVID. We have been impacted significantly by COVID, like so many organizations. This year, our annual donations went down by nearly 50%. So today's program and your ongoing support will enable us to move into the new year with renewed energy and commitment to our mission to make cultural institutions and places for everyone. Thank you so much.
Speaker View returns to Clare.
Thank you, Christina. So at this time, I'm thrilled to invite our featured guests on screen. Please welcome Emily Ladau and Risa Jazz Rifkind.
At top left, Risa. At top right, Emily.
Welcome, Emily and Risa. So I'm going to just share a little bit about our speakers today, and then I will hand the mic off to them. Emily is a passionate disability rights activist, writer, storyteller, and digital communications consultant. She serves as the editor-in-chief of the Rooted in Rights blog, a platform dedicated to amplifying authentic narratives on the disability experience through an intersectional lens. Her writing has been published in outlets including the New York Times, Self, Salon, Vice, and HuffPost. And her first book, Demystifying Disability, published by 10 Speed Press, an imprint of Penguin Random House, is available now. One of Emily's favorite cultural memories is seeing Hamilton on Broadway and getting to meet Taran Killam, who played King George after the show. Thanks for sharing that with us, Emily. And Risa is passionate about inclusion and the arts and serves as treasurer of CCAC's board. In her full-time role, she is the director of civic engagement and marketing for Disability Lead. In 2020, she also participated on the Disability Inclusion Fund's grant-making committee. Additionally, she supports organizations develop, implement, and institutionalize disability inclusion through workshops, training, and customized approaches as an independent consultant. Risa received a BA from Johns Hopkins University. And Risa shared that one of her favorite cultural memories is when her parents took her and her brother to Madison Square Garden to see Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young when she was 7 years old. And she recalls thinking the scene was both cool and weird, but that didn't stop her from standing on a chair and rocking out with the crowd. So thank you both for being here to utilize Emily's awesome new book as a conversation starter to dive into some really important topics. So I'm going to hand the mic to Risa and Emily to share their image descriptions. When we get to about 4 p.m. Central, we'll be sharing a brief video with you all, and then we will move into our live Q&A. So be sure to use that feature to submit questions while Risa and Emily are chatting. So Risa, you have the floor. Thank you both.
Claire leaves.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm Risa. I'm so thrilled to be here with you today. First things first, my pronouns are she, her, hers, an image description of myself. I'm in a very neutral office, otherwise relatively boring, except for the featured book behind me of Demystifying Disability. I'm wearing a purple sweater, gold jewelry, long brown curly hair, and I'm a brown woman with brown eyes. With that, I also want to invite Emily to quickly do a quick introduction, and then we'll hop into some fun conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Ladau. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with brown hair pulled to the side in a ponytail. I've got black rimmed glasses on, and I'm wearing a gray and purple striped sweater, and my background is blurred behind me. Risa, you're on it. You have the book next to you. I don't even have my book next to me.
And let me be your hype person today. It's only my role, so. Well, Emily, we're thrilled to have you here for CCAC's fundraiser, and I'm privileged that I was able to be a previous steering committee member, co-chair, and now on the board, and so have worn many, many hats in this organization, and this is such a crucial conversation for us to host. So really happy you're here. Like I said, I'll be your hype woman. I'm now pointing back to the book. Demystifying Disability is now listed on Books We Love and is being talked about in many, many spaces I'm in. And so that is so exciting to see. Before we get into the conversation though, Emily, one thing that you and I both feel strongly about is really emphasizing, who we are and the identities and perspectives we bring. And so today, we are both physically disabled women. We're both from New York. We're both Jewish. I am a woman of color. And there are many moments where we have similar experiences and different experiences, but really wanted to highlight that. And Emily, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that framing before we head into the conversation.
I appreciate that being the first point. And yes, this was something that we both felt it was so important to bring up. And this is a caveat that I give pretty much every time I do a presentation. I am a white woman with a physical disability who communicates verbally. I have several areas where my privilege and my marginalizations intersect. And so I want to acknowledge that I come to this conversation with a very particular lens. And by no means am I speaking for everyone in the disability community. I speak and represent only myself.
Really, really important. Thank you. We're not a monolith. I'm sure there are moments that we can relate to in so many ways, and I will share many of those moments. So thank you for including that. Emily, when we were talking earlier, we really wanted to get into a little bit for knowing that CCAC works with cultural institutions, a little bit more about your background and passions around cultural institutions, working with them and visiting them, and why they're so important to you. And I gotta say, I'm a little jealous of your Hamilton opening in the beginning.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because that was directly related to my disability. The theater was not super accessible. It was accessible. I had good seats, but at the end, they asked me to wait until everybody else piled out of the theater. And so because we were waiting so long for everybody to leave the theater, I got to meet Taryn Killam, who just happened to walk back out. So, disability perk, I guess, even though really it was an access choke point that caused me to have to wait to be the last one out. But anyway, to talk about cultural events, I was born with my physical disability. It is very much a part of who I am and how I navigate the world. And so cultural events have particular significance for me because they have always been something that I can do. They have always been something that has felt welcoming to me, that I felt like I can be a part of, that I can get into, that I can participate in. I was a drama club kid when I was in high school. I was a choir kid. So, cultural events were where I felt like I could find my fit because I wasn't playing sports, right? I wasn't going to the football games on the soccer field. And so I really found my home in a lot of cultural events as I was developing my sense of self. But there's always that catch-22 of, do these cultural events actually want me in their spaces? Do these cultural locations want me as part of that space? And so as much as I felt like it was a place where I could find my place, I also often struggled because of access barriers, because of the hoops that you have to jump through to participate. And so it's sort of an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, theater and music and concerts and museums, these are places where I felt at home, but sometimes I'm not always sure that they want me to feel at home there. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to accessibility in cultural spaces for me. But for me, ultimately, it has been a vital part of my life.
This is Risa. Emily, thanks for sharing that. I feel like it's such an interesting concept for you to bring up of like a mixed bag. I feel like, for me too, a lot of the things that I'm passionate about also stem from moments where I felt very excluded. For me, growing up in New York, my mom was an actress before I was born, and she too is a woman of color, and she stopped acting because of racism in the industry. That didn't stop her love of theater. We went to the theater, and in the theater too, I experienced so many moments where there was a choke point, as you put it. And so here I am, in my adult life, hoping to make, art more accessible and inclusive. So, that really, really resonated with me. So I think I'm gonna move on to talking a little bit, about the book. And, it was intended and created, as you wrote, as a basic grounding and foundation of disability. There's just so much I found as a disabled person that was really relatable, and also recognized it was geared towards building allyship as well. Have you been finding, the feedback from other people with disabilities to ring true and relatable to them? What have you been finding the conversation been, feedback been about from allies about your book?
Speaking of mixed bags, I think, again, the phrase is relevant here. It's been a mixed bag of responses. There are so many people who have been incredibly warm and receptive in regards to the book. And they've said that it makes them feel seen, that it makes them feel understood, that it gives them a good reference point if they're struggling to explain a particular issue to someone, or they're just tired of being a teachable moment all the time. They can say, hey, here's a book I'd like you to read as a starting point. And so I'm really happy to be that resource for people. But then there's very much a flip side to that, which is that a lot of people feel that the book is, not nearly in depth enough. And so you've got some people who think it's too radical, some people who think it's not radical enough, some people who think it's just right. It's like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears version of a book. And I understood that was going to happen. But I think seeing it in action has reminded me that with 1.3 billion plus disabled people in the world, you're first of all going to have 1.3 billion plus opinions and experiences of disability. And second, statistically speaking, everybody in this world knows someone or is someone with a disability. And that means you also have to contend with their perspectives based on how they've been socialized to think about and understand disability. And so some people feel that the book is chastising them for not knowing enough, and other people feel that the information in the book is something that people should already know, and that it's incumbent upon them to have known this, and why am I offering this starting point? So it's really been all over the place in terms of reception, both from disabled people, from people who are allies, from people who say that they're allies, but really just kind of slap the badge on and don't actually do anything with the label. So I realize that I'm never going to reach everybody, but my hope is that I can connect with as many people as possible to really open these dialogues and have these important conversations.
This is Risa. I'm just so curious about the framing of, radical or too radical, not radical enough. Is that really what you were talking about related to just various experiences, 1.3 billion experiences, or was there more in there? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, I'm glad to dive into that a little more. And I think the truth is that everyone is at a different point in their process of thinking about and learning about disability. And so for some people, there's the expectation that topics like language and etiquette are things that you should just already know. But my argument is that so much of this is not taught in classroom curricula. There is really no history lesson on disability in the vast majority of mainstream school classrooms. And there really is no open conversation about disability as part of diversity, as an identity. We're socialized to understand it as a negative. We're socialized to push it away, push it to the side, and not talk about it or acknowledge it, because to do so is seen as a bad thing. And so when you exist in a world where you have these pieces working against you of not being taught about it, of not seeing it represented nearly enough in the media, of treating it like it's a taboo, I understand why it is that it's an overwhelming and maybe intimidating topic for people. However, when I share that, there are many people who say acknowledging that disability can be intimidating or scary to talk about is in and of itself very ableist. And so I'm accused often of perpetuating the ableism that I'm trying to fight. But I've come to understand that if I don't acknowledge where we are, we're not going to get to where we should be. And so I'm willing to say things like, yes, disability is kind of intimidating if you've not been socialized to understand that it's just part of the human experience. And that flies with some people and it doesn't fly with other people. And I think that that just kind of shows that, there's a huge and many varied thread of or tapestry with so many different threads of how we think about disability and how we talk about disability. And I respect that and I understand that. And I know it adds a lot of complexity to the conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to have.
This is Risa. I think that reminds me too of the framing that I hear a lot of, like, well, I didn't know what to do, so I did nothing, or I didn't know who to connect with, so I connect, and like, where do I get started? And I feel like oftentimes, people are looking for a resource that is really well organized and a checklist, and that doesn't necessarily exist when we talk about the full breadth of disability. Now, I feel like Demystifying Disability, your book, does give a really great grounding, as you described. One of the things that your book dives into, and I think people really always have questions about, is language. And I find, discussing language sometimes is tricky when I'm training on it, when I'm talking to groups about it, because it's just so fluid. It changes and it's evolving and personal. And one thing that stood out to me was how you had a very vulnerable dialogue in your book around person-first language and identity-first language, using people with disabilities versus disabled people. I feel I struggled with that too, and almost has the opposite feeling where you preferred identity-first language because it reflected your humanity. I felt like because of so much stigma around disability, that person-first language was, initially my preference, which was interesting because I have what I would call disability pride and dwarf pride, and so here we are with two different experiences and preferences. And now, though, I'm finding myself using identity-first language and person-first language more interchangeably. Can you talk a little bit more about your preference for identity-first language a little bit more, and then maybe a little bit more about language more broadly and, its implications for usage?
Yeah, this is Emily. So something you said really stood out to me about people wanting that checklist, just wanting it all spelled out for them. And I'm always quick to remind people, my book is never meant to have all the answers, and that it's not the definitive guide to everything on disability. It's not the encyclopedia. It's not the Bible. It's just one person's attempt to gather some information about disability in the pages of a book. And This is especially important when it comes to language, because so many people come to me and say, okay, can I say disability? Is it okay? Do I call you a disabled person? Do I call you a person with a disability? What about special needs? What about physically challenged? The list just goes on. And I think people want very straightforward answers to these questions, because most people are very well meaning. They just want to know what they're supposed to do. But the thing is, I can't really tell you 100% how to talk about disability, because it is so based on personal preference, as evidenced by what you were sharing about your preference and my preference on language. And like you, I go back and forth on using person with a disability and disabled person, and neither one of those is wrong and neither one of them is right. It's really a matter of personal preference. And so I try to remind people, if there's one ultimate rule to keep in mind, it would be respecting personal preference. And if you don't have the opportunity to directly ask someone what their preference is, just don't be afraid to say the word disability. There are definitely disabled people who do not prefer the word disability, but as a whole, it is okay to say the word disability unless somebody tells you otherwise. It's not this negative, scary word that people seem to think it is. And I don't want people to shy away from it, no matter what kind of language they use. But then we start getting into the territory of special needs and physically challenged and differently abled. And that's where you lose me personally, because I've always asked, why are my needs so special? I don't think they're special. I think they're human. And if I'm differently abled, aren't you also differently abled, because your abilities are different than mine? So doesn't this make no sense? So, I'm just a fan of saying the word. But at the same time, if somebody has a different preference, if somebody says they prefer differently abled, just respect that preference. It's about respect at the end of the day.
This is Risa. Yes, say the word. I'm just going to say that again. Say the word. And I see someone in the chat is also amplifying your comments just now. I feel like, related to language is also just this, general disability etiquette. So I'm going to get to a question about that in a second. A few other moments that really stood out to me as being, you were singing my song, you were super relatable, was when you were describing how something as simple as putting on a coat, people perceived you were struggling and their reaction to you, or, that swooping in for me to open a door is always like the biggest thing I've ever seen in my life, or when being prayed over, which happens a lot. And as a fellow Jew, it's very confusing for a lot of reasons. And then that just invasion of personal space. One of my favorite stories to tell, I don't know if that's a good word to describe it, is when I was in Disney World several years ago, someone, I guess, was very tired of waiting online, and they, like all of us were, and leaned on my scooter, and I was just over it. You said earlier, teachable moments. That was not a teachable moment for me. So I just moved, didn't tell them, and they almost fell. Maybe it wasn't one of my classiest moments, but it was how I was feeling in that moment, But one of the things we talked about also was, you don't mind when people lean down to talk to you. For me, I get very confused, and oftentimes I feel like people end up too close to my personal space. Another example of how we are similar and different, and we're not a monolith. So can you talk about a little bit of like, how does someone know what to do? How do they realize that my preference might be different than your preference?
The etiquette chapter was so challenging to write, because as with everything else about disability, there's not ever going to be hard and fast rules. I mean, certainly there are things that should be hard and fast rules, like don't be condescending, don't be patronizing, be respectful. But I think the ground rule that constantly comes to mind for me in these conversations is act like yourself. I think that when people see someone with a disability, there's immediately this inclination to change how they talk, to change their mannerisms, to change what they would normally do. Act like you usually would. I mean, that seems to be the best advice I have ever been able to give, because again, there's no right answer. And if acting like you usually would means that you're kind of being a jerk, then I would encourage you to revisit how you usually act. So, there is a caveat to that rule. But I will say that I really prefer people to just say, hey, do you need help? Can I help you? Rather than imposing that help on me. And I also prefer people to say, is there something that I can do to make this more accessible to you? Instead of assuming what it is that I want. And I find that is challenging when a stranger swoops in and makes the assumption before you even had a moment to be like, hey, whoa, I don't want this. And then suddenly it's incumbent upon you to accept that, because otherwise you're the jerk all of a sudden for not accepting the help that you didn't want in the first place. But I realize that there are always going to be differences in how people want to be helped and how people want to be approached. And I think the example that you shared is a perfect one, because whereas for me, I get so tired craning my neck and I wish people would just kind of like back up or like lower themselves down for me. I can also see a flip side of that where it's really uncomfortable, really in your face, and can almost feel kind of condescending or patronizing, depending on the person's stance. So it's so situationally dependent. And I feel like if we just stop overthinking and we just say, what feels natural in this moment? And how can I make this moment a more natural interaction? That would reduce, I would say, like at least 50% of the awkwardness that we tend to encounter when it comes to issues of etiquette.
I think Risa, totally. Just ask, and that goes a long way for me too. I feel like when people go and ask, it almost then makes an inaccessible moment too, because if someone's assuming I need help, they jump in front of my scooter. I'm now at the wrong angle. Now I'm really struggling. Now it's a scene. So I see you shaking and nodding too. So yeah, and Emily, in your book, you also talked about how you want people to also just move on, right? Like when you say you don't want help or like something happens, you just want a situation to be over. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
This is Emily. And yes, thank you for bringing that up, because I think what happens is as soon as we make a mistake, and I do that, I've done this too. I am guilty of this. I will dwell on that mistake for so long, but then I almost want to be like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I cannot stop saying I am sorry. And then suddenly the responsibility is on the person who experienced the microaggression, experienced the inaccessibility, who was on the receiving end of your poor etiquette. Suddenly it's on them to make you feel better about what you just did or to educate you about it. And it becomes a really uncomfortable interaction. And there's so much emotional labor involved in that. So the best thing you can do is say, hey, I really apologize. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I'm going to do better next time, and not turn it into an entire dialogue on you and how you're going to resolve to be a better person and do better, So, I mean, that's different than not taking ownership of it. I want to be very clear. It's one thing to apologize and try to move on, but I don't mean be flippant about it or act like it didn't happen. I just mean there's no need to dwell to the point of it being awkward and uncomfortable. Take that ownership, apologize, then go educate yourself so that you can do better next time. And if educating yourself looks like having a conversation with the person who you've caused harm to, I think that's totally okay. But again, that's very context dependent. Like I was once, and I told this story in the book, but I was in a parking lot and I was with my mother, who's also a wheelchair user. And a guy started like making racing flag motions and like noises and stuff. And he was, just being super obnoxious. And we were like, sir, can you move? We're just trying to get to our car. And he followed us to the car, started apologizing, walked away when we told him to leave, came back in his car, tried to give my dad $20 as an apology. And then when my dad drove off and wouldn't take the $20, the guy gave us the finger as we were pulling out of the parking lot. And I was like, and that is an example of how you do not dwell on something that you did wrong. You say sorry, you walk away, you leave us alone. Anyway, that's just the story that comes to mind in this scenario.
This is Risa. That sounds awfully traumatizing and like 7 stages of what not to do. And it's funny, we didn't coordinate this necessarily, but you brought up your mom. So I'm going to ask you a question. In the book, you talk about how having your mom who has the same disability as you has been so influential in your life. And, for me, I'm a little person, and growing up in Little People of America for my entire life, my family, I'm the only one with dwarfism in my family. They didn't know what to do all the time, but my parents knew that I needed to be around other little people from a very, very early age, and what that looks like to be amongst, friends my age, and also to see and understand what an adult with a disability, what an adult with dwarfism can do, have our own lives, our own choices, live independently, et cetera, et cetera. So just curious to hear what it's meant to you, and why it's so important for us to continue that model.
This is Emily, and so the other day I was talking about my mother, as I do in pretty much every event ever. And so she likes to make the joke now that every time I talk about her, I have to give her a nickel. And then I was doing an event yesterday, and she literally rolled up behind my computer and put a jar of nickels on my desk so that I can start giving her nickels every time I talk about her. So I know if she can hear me right now, she's probably waiting for another nickel, but gotta use her where I can. She also has the same disability that I do. It's a genetic disability. And most people assume that that is a tragedy, but for me, having that built-in role model to show me what it's like to advocate and how to navigate challenging situations, and to let me know that I'm not alone, and to show me that, yes, in fact, you are going to become a disabled adult. That's a really powerful thing to have. And so, I'm so glad that your family was also immediately like, okay, we got to make sure that Risa knows other little people. We got to make sure that this is a part of her life growing up. And I think for me, that's absolutely what shaped so much of who I am, because it's not as though it was very easy for me to just turn on the television and see myself. I really didn't, with very few exceptions. And having my mom and also my uncle, her younger brother, who has the same disability as well, was a lesson to me, although unspoken most of the time, that I was going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Disability is not something that is a tragedy. It's just something that's going to be part of your experience, and that's okay. And so, I think to draw a bridge here back to the cultural accessibility aspect of things, being able to see myself represented has become such a gift. And I think we'll, dive into that more if I recall correctly, but it's a gift that I wish everybody had. I really do. Seeing someone who looks like them, reminds themselves of them, and shows them that there's a pathway forward.
I think this is Risa. I think you're right. It's a gift, and you know what? Why don't we just get to that question now? I know we were gonna wait till later, and you know, I do want to say that this question is a little heavy, very heavy. So you know, audience, prepare. But you know, an example of history that is not taught that you talk about, you know, in the history section of the book is, but critical to know is around forced sterilization and eugenics. And, you know, you talk about, you know, a way how that has been used to either lessen or even eradicate disabled people in the world. And just last month, the first drug that's targeted at achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism, if not the kind that I have, but it came on the market with the promise of making people taller. And I feel like this is the beginning of many, you know, moments like this if science is continuing in this direction and the medical field and science are continuing in this direction. You know, do you have thoughts on how we as a society at large can work towards ensuring that we are not eradicated, that's not what we want, that we are part of, you know, the diversity and, like you said, part of the natural experience of the world, of humans?
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the way that eugenics is part of our past and our present. It's not something that is simply in the history textbooks. It's very much alive and well in terms of a practice and a mentality and a philosophy. And so when I think about the fact that there are people who are actively working to eradicate people like you and people like me simply on the basis of how we look and how we move around the world, you know, that's not an easy topic for me to grapple with. And I really encourage people to think long and hard about the value judgments that you're placing on another human being if you think that their life is not worth living, if you think that people like us should be eradicated based on your judgments of what disability means and what disability is. And, you know, a lot of this actually plays into media representation because we're fed very specific narratives of disability. It's a tragedy or it's inspiring that we've overcome it, right? There's rarely this middle ground of it's just another part of a person. And so when you think about it that way, suddenly it doesn't feel like too far of a leap for people to think, oh, well, it would be a good thing if we got rid of disability because it is so tragic, it is so harmful. These are the narratives that we're fed. If we shift the narrative, if we flip the script and we begin to change attitudes about disability, then maybe we can begin to move away from these eugenic practices and these assumptions that you're doing the community a favor by trying to eradicate their disabilities.
Yes, this is Risa. Yes to all of that. And, you know, like you said, it's part of history. And I feel like what is important about history is we learn from it, and we haven't yet learned from this. So, you know, it's really heartbreaking to say the least. I want to stay on a kind of heavy conversation, and then we'll wrap up with a little bit lighter of a question. But I think a conversation that you brought up in the book and that is so critical to have is how we as disabled people can also perpetuate ableism. I think this is also related to what you talk about of a hierarchy of value and power, and what you also just described as worth, you know, our lives worth living. So can you talk a little bit more about how we as disabled people, what we should be doing to stop that perpetuation of ableism? You know, I think that's what, I don't hear that conversation enough within our community, and wanting to have it openly here with you today.
This is Emily, and I think that there is this wrong understanding that so many disabled people have that because you are marginalized in some way, you're free and absolved of having to be a good ally to people whose identities are different than yours. And I feel like we need to do away with that mindset, because my disability does not mean that I understand marginalizations that I don't experience. It simply means that I am marginalized in one way, but I have privilege in lots of ways. And there are plenty of things that I can still do to support people whose experiences are different than mine. But I think that we've not yet dug into that conversation enough as a community. And I think that disabled people have not yet begun to really dive into what it actually means to look at things through an intersectional lens. You know, it's a buzzword that we love to throw around. Oh, yes, intersectionality, but it doesn't really work like that. It's not just a buzzword. We literally have to step back and understand that intersectionality is addressing the different layers of oppression that people experience based on their identities. And if we're not taking the time to recognize that, you know, for example, me as a white woman, if I'm not taking the time to recognize where my privilege comes into play and how I should be passing the mic, how I should be amplifying the perspectives of other people, I'm not really doing a great job of being an ally. And honestly, I'm kind of being a cruddy disabled person, if I can be real. So I do think that we need to acknowledge that disabled people can perpetuate ableism. And beyond the conversation of intersecting identities, there's also so often this hierarchy of disability that is perpetuated, which is really problematic. So, for example, when I was younger, I used to really be sent the message all the time that, you know, it's okay if your legs don't work because your mind is fine, you know? And at the time, I think everyone who said that to me thought that that was a way to be affirming. But what they were really saying was, you're in a wheelchair, but you're still better than people with cognitive disabilities, you know, and that's not the messaging that we need to be perpetuating. We cannot perpetuate hierarchy, and we need to be mindful of our privilege.
This is Risa. Yes, you know, and you also write that you look like the accessible disabled pink side where it's a white figure in a wheelchair on a blue background. And, you know, I appreciate that description because I think that's a recognition, you know, of power and privilege. And I'm thinking about a very specific moment you write about in the book regarding a disabled Black man on the subway, you know, and I'll let you talk more about that in a second. And, you know, as a woman of color, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man in the US. I do relate to feeling ignored and like requests are not taken seriously. And I feel like that is connected to race and disability and other identities and gender for me in that moment, like it was to that man that you talked about. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that and, you know, describe that in a little more detail.
This is Emily, and definitely, and I realize that this is a really messy topic to wade into, and I will try my best to do it justice, but I'm glad you brought it up. If there's one part of the book that was hardest to write, it honestly might have been those few sentences about the experience on the subway. So essentially, I was waiting for a train in Penn Station in New York, and there was a Black man using a wheelchair who was in ripped and dirty clothes, and he had a cup of coins, and there were several passersby, and he was asking all of the passersby if they could just hang his tote bag off the back of his wheelchair for him. And this is something that I've actually asked for help with too. I've very often just said to someone standing next to me in line or something at a Starbucks, like, could you just hang this bag on the back of my chair? Or can you just grab the bag off the back of my chair? And people will do it for me, no problem. But for this Black man using a wheelchair, and it was a very medical hospital sort of wheelchair, you know, people walked right by him. I don't even think most of them actually processed his request. They simply just kept walking. And the interesting part of the dynamic was that I was right there the whole time, but the man didn't ask me if I would help. And so there's so many layers to unpack there. But I finally went over to him and I said, hey, do you mind if I just grab your tote bag and hang it for you? And he was like, oh, yeah, thank you. And it took 2 seconds and it was no problem. But I mean, gosh, the layers there, first I'm sitting here wondering why he's not asking me to help him because I'm also in a wheelchair, but I'm wondering why other people are not helping him, but people would be so quick to help me. And I just think that so much of it then comes down to the dynamics of race and power and privilege and the assumptions that we make about people just by looking at them. Because for me, I'm so often perceived as the damsel in distress that people will just like come up to me and offer help when I'm sitting there doing nothing. But this gentleman was actively asking for help and not getting it. And so I think that little anecdote really just encompasses the very messy dynamics of power and privilege and race and disability and why none of those things exist in a vacuum.
This is Risa, and why we can't talk about one thing without the other, right? And how, stopping ableism also means being anti-racist and more. And so I want to ask you a question, recognizing, how that we as physically disabled people show up for non-physically disabled people, people with other disabilities. Can you share some of the stories? Because in your book, you do a wonderful job of getting so many stories from so many experiences. Want to give you a moment to share, one or two of your top stories that you want to share about people with disabilities that are not physical disabilities.
I'm really glad we're bringing this up. And, it's so true that I come to this conversation with the perspective of someone with a physical disability. But I think some of the things that resonated most with me were interviewing people who are autistic and talking about the concepts of presuming competence. And, I want to really uplift that particular section in the book because so often people with cognitive disabilities are presumed incompetent simply on the basis of their diagnosis. And that's an incredibly unfair assumption to come to. So instead, we need to presume competence. We need to approach every situation presuming that the person that we're interacting with is competent to engage. And so, it wasn't necessarily a story that was shared, but it was just engaging in the process of interviewing about that and realizing that people with cognitive disabilities are dehumanized in ways that I've not experienced dehumanization. And I honestly feel like I am not qualified to in any way be a spokesperson for people who have cognitive disabilities, for people who have different disabilities than mine. I feel like my job as someone who is passionate about storytelling is to uplift the stories of other people and to center those stories. So, throughout the etiquette book, there's different stories by people with different disabilities than mine, talking about encounters that they've had. For example, how do you approach someone who is deafblind? How do you have a conversation about chronic illness with someone who is chronically ill? Right. And so, I don't even feel like I can pick one or two stories. I feel like I want to point people to get the stories from these people directly. And apologies for the phone. It's real life. It's happening.
This is Risa, and I think that's what's so unique too about the way you approach that storytelling. Not unique for you, because you've been doing it for many years, but unique as a whole, that people are telling their own stories in your book. You're not telling their stories for them. And so please check it out. We have a couple more minutes. I see one Q&A in the Q&A box. So please start populating your questions in there. Emily and I are going to be back in a couple of minutes after a brief break. But before we hop off, Emily, can you just quickly talk about the various formats that are available for demystifying disability? I think that's really crucial to just mention.
Yes, super, super quickly, I will say that I wanted Demystifying Disability to be available in a multitude of formats. So it is available, of course, as the print version. It's also available in audiobook. You can get it digitally. I worked with someone on a plain language translation, which is available for free on my website. I've also got a full image description of the entire book cover on my website. You can find the book on Bookshare, which is a platform that makes books available for free and makes them accessible for people with different types of disabilities. And I've been informed that hopefully in the new year, it's going to be findable on the National Library Service for the blind and print disabled. So it's got a lot of formats, and I would encourage people, especially in cultural institutions, to think about how they can also provide a multitude of formats for the materials that they create.
Claire joins at bottom left.
Amazing.
Perfect.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thanks, Risa. Yeah, this is so incredible. Thank you both. I'm so excited that we're going to hear from you both more after a short video. So thanks for this great conversation so far. I'm going to invite Risa and Emily to exit the screen momentarily. And we'd like to just take 5 to play a short video for you all to give you a better sense of what CCAC does and also help you understand why your support today and moving forward makes such a big difference for the programs and resources that we offer. So after the video, I'm going to invite Emily and Risa back on screen. We will answer some of those questions that you've submitted, and we'll look forward to doing that in just a few. So thanks for staying with us.
Video plays. Colorful triangles flash. Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. A rosette blinks on. Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. CCAC programs. Event photographs showing people engaged virtually and in person at venues across Chicago. Topics highlighted include Intro to Cultural Accessibility, Welcoming Veterans, Sensory Friendly Summit, ASL interpreters and Zoom, captions for Zoom and YouTube Live, Project Potential, Book Club, What Can a Body Do, Adapting and Advancing, crowdsourced videos from CCAC supporters.
Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium has empowered me with an incredible array of resources.
CCAC is creating solutions to problems like cultural spaces not knowing how to use and manage accessibility equipment, such as assistive listening devices or captioning.
CCAC is leading by example with their everyday inclusive communications and workshops where access is given priority and available without request.
CCAC is leading by example by making sure their programs, like the digital ones and the in-person ones, are available and accessible to everyone who wants to attend them.
CCAC creates a community where accessibility advocates can share, learn, and find support.
CCAC has empowered me to confidently navigate options for our visitors and to champion the impact of accessible programming within my own institution.
CCAC is leading by example by creating a safe space for knowledge sharing and problem solving.
CCAC has empowered me to keep going by reminding me that access is a journey, not a final destination.
CCAC has empowered me to view cross-collaboration and partnership in a more comprehensive way.
CCAC is also leading by example, case in point, providing ongoing learning opportunities, even internally. CCAC in this regard really is a model.
CCAC is leading by example by continuing to emphasize incremental change within cultural spaces and by finding new voices to represent perspectives of disability.
CCAC has empowered me to speak about my personal experiences with disability and speak up for others in the disabled community who want to experience cultural institutions and enjoy them the way everyone does.
We'd like to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for supporting CCAC.
The CCAC logo snaps on. A woman speaks in front of a white brick wall while photographs show different programs.
I'm Christina Gunther, the founder and president of Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, CCAC. The mission of CCAC is to empower Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. We facilitate a dynamic community of cultural administrators and people with disabilities to remove barriers in the Chicago region's cultural organizations. How do we use our funds? The funds CCAC raises covers the cost of operational resources, including accounting software, virtual platforms, and the resources necessary to manage a nonprofit. CCAC is committed to honoring the time and perspectives of all of the experts that participate in our different professional development events. We provide honorariums for every guest speaker. We're also passionate about modeling accessibility in our programming. Funding covers the cost of service providers, including captioners and American Sign Language ASL interpreters, as well as the cost of integrating accessible features into our program recordings, such as audio description. What do our volunteers do? CCAC is run entirely by volunteers. Our steering committee members coordinate and manage all of CCAC's professional development workshops, our equipment loan program, and our access calendar. CCAC's breadth of programming and geographic reach has grown immensely since we started in 2013. We've delivered over 60 programs serving more than 3,300 attendees. Our listserv has over 1,100 members from around Chicago and the world. We've provided free access equipment for over 50 organizations in the Chicago region. And we've featured nearly 250 accessible programs on our access calendar. Overall, we've reached more than 5,000 individuals across our combined offerings since we started. Become a part of the CCAC community by utilizing our programs and resources, spreading the word, and offering your financial support. Together, we can make Chicago a more accessible and inclusive place for everyone. Thank you for supporting CCAC.
To donate, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org/support at bottom center in ASL interpreter signs.
Hello again, everyone. This is Claire joining from audio only. I'd like to invite Emily and Risa back on screen.
Joining at top left, Risa, and at top right, Emily.
And thank you all for staying with us to view our video. Please know there is a donation link in the chat if you'd like to extend your support for CCAC. And at this time, we're going to move into our live Q&A portion. We have some really great audience questions that I'm excited to share. So first one, Emily, is actually from a former Rooted in Rights colleague who gave you a shout out and is very proud of you in your book. The question is, as a mental health counselor in training, how can I best use your book to discuss diversity issues to counselors who may have clients that have a disability?
Oh my God, hi cookies. I'm so happy to, I want to say see you here, but feel your presence. Perhaps that's the right way of putting that. It's a great question. And my goal with this book was really to create something that as many audiences as possible can use to engage in conversations around disability. But I also think that there's something to be said for not just handing people a resource on disability and kind of leaving them to figure it out on their own. You know, that's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot now that the book is out in the world. How can we continue to have these conversations? Because I only wanted the book to be a starting point, not an ending point. And I know that it's going to open up so many other questions. So I have really seen success in having a book club format where people, and I'm actively involved in a couple of these right now, where people are reading the book chapter by chapter, then stopping, having a conversation, talking about what questions are being brought up for them, you know, really creating a safe space to engage in the content of the book, and then also choosing from the resources in the back ways to continue forward. So I think that guided reading and guided conversation can be incredibly helpful. I also understand that is labor in and of itself, especially for other disabled people to put together those educational opportunities. But I have found that having those guided group conversations is a really powerful way to get the conversations going. So that's my best recommendation. I think a lot of us can, do some learning in isolation, but when there's community, there's power.
Great, thank you, Emily. This is Claire again, joining in. So before we proceed with more questions, I do just want to note we have tons of awesome questions here. So what we will do if we're not able to get to them all today is connect with Risa and Emily after and share some questions and answers to our guests after today. So please know that we will address it if we're not able to do it live. So next question, and Risa and Emily, this can be a shared response, however you'd like to join in. How do you respond to people who do have a disability but are hesitant or resistant to using the word disability? Specifically, this submitter works in higher ed and says many students are concerned about requesting accommodations or being categorized as disabled. And the same may go for older adults who have possibly acquired disability with age. So what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. This is Risa. I'll try and go first, but Emily, please jump in. Recognizing there is still so much stigma and so much discrimination that still happens in our world today, and so certainly understand, where and why there might be hesitancy, whether for those two groups I think you mentioned, Claire, or for other people who might not fall into those identities. I often have conversation with people, and maybe even some of you in this webinar, hi friends, about why we should identify as having a disability. I feel like one, really, if we need accommodations to succeed, we deserve those accommodations. And so if that's what we need in our workplace, in our job, in our school, please go after them. It'll help you be successful. My accommodations help me be successful. And I say that in a way in which not success of like getting, but being the best I can be, whatever that looks like. And, also though, I feel like it's such a cool community to be part of. I get to make connections like Emily and so many other friends that are on the webinar today, because we all are part of this wonderfully large and diverse community. It's a sense of pride to be part of this community, and it also feels really good to be part of this community. I think it's an ongoing conversation, especially sometimes, for people who, not like me, were not born with a disability, and it is a journey. And those of us born with our disability identity too, it's a journey as well. How I feel about my disability one day might be different and another day. And Emily, I think that you talk about that too in your book. But all that to say is, take your time, please join us. I always love when I say, well, welcome to the community, because that is what it should be like when you decide to say, I have a disability. Emily, what do you want to add to that? I'm sure there's so much more.
Risa, I echo everything that you're saying about how the disability community is a pretty cool community to be a part of. But something I've had to come to understand is that there are so many cultural implications around disability. There are cultures that consider it a curse. There are cultures where it's taboo to talk about. I was just doing an event yesterday, and a Black disabled woman was explaining that disability was just something that you don't really talk about in the community that she grew up in. And so, I have to remind myself constantly that there are so many cultural implications that go into how a person chooses to identify. And, it's not up to me to push an identity on anyone, but what I can do is show people that it is something that I celebrate and that I embrace, and show them that if they want to do the same, not only can they and should they, but they're welcome to. They're welcome. They're going to be embraced with open arms into a community of people who want to be there, who want them to be celebrated for who they are. But you know, that's not everybody's preference, and it's not my job to push that on them. It's just my job to let them know that I see them and I celebrate them for who they are.
This is Risa, and I'm totally gonna add more, even though I went first. But you know, I also think it's a recognition of, like, if you are in a position and ready to identify as having a disability publicly, you get to show up then completely as yourself. You know, and I think there's something to be said when we get to be who we are in all spaces of our lives. And that comes with privilege. I'm not saying it doesn't. Emily, you talked about, you know, cultural experiences that are very real. And again, discrimination is very real. And also being who we are without apology is very cool too, you know, and I think it's also about creating culture where people feel comfortable disclosing their disability, whether at work or in other spaces. So just adding that.
Yes, and honestly, I would just add one more thing to that, and then I know there are other questions, but so, you know, for me, and I would imagine also for you, you know, when people see us in person, it's not like we can hide our disabilities. Even if we don't identify as such, our disabilities are quite visible. But something that I've noticed is that now that we're in, you know, Zoom event pandemic mode, I'm the one who's openly disclosing my disability, whereas before my disability disclosed itself just by looking at me in most cases. Now I'm constantly, you know, having to say, and what you don't see on the screen is that I am a wheelchair user, you know? And so suddenly I'm in this new position of disclosing and finding new ways to own and embrace my identity. And so that's a journey. That's a journey. And I respect that everybody is at a different place in it.
Thank you both. This is Claire again. So another question, and we're going to try to do 2 more questions before we finish up. So most of the discussion around DEI does not include disability, which you touched on a bit in your conversation. Most is just centered on race. What are your thoughts on this? Do you have suggestions for how we can get disability layered into the conversation? And are there organizations you can shout out who center disability and race?
This is Risa. Emily's like, you go first, so I'll go first.
I just want to create space so it's not me dominating. That's all.
You are not dominating. No, it's totally fine. You know, I think that goes back to what Emily and I were talking about just a few moments ago, you know, in recognizing where race, disability, and other identities play into moments of ableism and discrimination and racism. And so, you know, there's a saying out there, I think it's on t-shirts now, if your diversity plan doesn't include disability, you're doing it wrong. That is so true, because how can we separate those identities? And, you know, thinking specifically about the audience and you all mostly being in Chicago, it's the recognition that 2/3 of people with disabilities in the city of Chicago are people of color. So our thoughts, our strategies, our work will not be successful unless we recognize that, you know, those intersectional identities are crucial in talking about DEI work, diversity work. You know, there are a lot of great organizations doing very cool work. I feel like it's self-serving, but I'll just go ahead and put it in there. You know, CCAC is on a journey of talking about race and disability together. My daytime job at Disability Lead, we launched something called the Collab that is bringing together disability justice and racial justice work primarily in Chicago. There are also very cool organizations across the country. I encourage you to check out the grantees, really, from the Disability Inclusion Fund. Those are all organizations who are doing this work. But Emily, please jump in.
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to amplify a couple of helpful resources. First, I'll drop the links in the chat. So Skin, Tooth, and Bone is a primer from Sins Invalid, which is an organization that has a very strong disability justice focus. And, they're a really great starting point for diving deeper into the connections between race and disability. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention one of my day jobs, which is the Disability and Philanthropy Forum, which is actually directly related to what Risa was just mentioning about the Disability Inclusion Fund and the grantees that are doing incredible work. And I know that this is not a philanthropic audience, but nevertheless, I think that many of the resources would be of use, including quite a bit on the connections between racism and ableism and race and disability. So those are some really, really helpful starting points. But I just encourage you to pick a starting point, dive in, keep going.
Well said. Thank you both. Claire speaking again here. And one final question before I hop back on screen with you both for some closing remarks. And this is a really important one. So you both expressed this and how you deal with it, but I'd like your advice, the submitter says. As someone with a disability that is always advocating and teaching others, how do you keep yourself motivated? How do you practice self-care when you are exhausted from your advocacy efforts?
Whew, okay, I'll take this one first. The honest truth is I'm not always the best at it. I preach it to others, but don't always practice what I preach. And it's challenging when this is not just my identity, but also my work. And at the end of the day, I can't go into my bedroom, take my wheelchair off, put it on a shelf, and then suddenly I'm not disabled anymore. My identity is part of me, regardless of whether I'm working or playing or sleeping or whatever the case may be. And so to give myself time and space is a continuous and conscious and concerted effort that I'm not always very good at. But I try to at least make space in my day to give myself the chance to move, which I enjoy, to exercise. I try to give myself time in my day to, watch something on Netflix. I try to spend my weekends not spending every waking moment thinking about advocacy and going to theater. I'm a big fan of just like offbeat plays and these little random theaters in like the basement of a building or whatever. I love stuff like that. So yeah, just finding moments of space for myself. But the honest truth is I have to continually remind myself, otherwise I won't do it. I will never take the hat off. It's always on. Risa, what about you?
No, this is Risa. I mean, I'm not very good at it either, of always being an advocate. I don't think my story of, letting someone fall because they're leaning on my scooter is like a very nice one. But it just means that I'm superhuman, and just superhuman, not a superhuman, very human. I have my flaws. I have my moments where I'm not, who I am all the time. But for self-care, I feel like I'm learning too what that means for me and what, a break is. I'm trying desperately to not look at my emails all the time during like late hours. I get reminders all the time that I looked at an email after like a very late hour. So I'm trying not to do that. I think that really helps. I enjoy some good retail therapy online for sure. So, I don't know if that's healthy either, but just trying to find moments of like rest and relaxation. And, I made a very big change in my life and I moved closer to family. And so I think that was a very big recognition of like self-care and just doing what I need to do to be happier and the happiest version of myself.
Claire joins at bottom left.
Amazing. Thank you both. I'm going to join on screen here and we're going to close in just a second, but I just wanted to add one more quick question and see if either of you have thoughts on what this conversation was like for you today. It was so amazing to hear you share your personal perspectives, how they overlap and how they differ, and any takeaways from you from the chat today?
I mean, my big takeaway, to be honest, is like, I'm definitely making Risa my best friend after this is over. So that's my real honest takeaway. But in all seriousness, I think this chat is a reminder that there's never a stopping point in this conversation, because there's always so much to talk about and so many different perspectives to share. And I hope that as I am trying to continue to evolve and continue to learn, that everyone else who has joined us today will do the same.
I'm so glad you want to be best friends. That's my takeaway too. No, but I think also just, it is always exciting in ways that I can't always articulate of what it means to have spaces like this, to have these kind of dialogues where we learn from each other and together. I think that's so crucial. And I think the takeaway is that there's still just so much more conversation and learning left to be had for all of us, and looking forward to what that looks like.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I, speaking for myself, really enjoyed the conversation. Knowing you both, I always learn so much from both of you, and every time I hear you speak. So special thank you to Emily and Risa for this invaluable conversation. I'm sure that our audience today enjoyed it just as much as I did. And so thank you both for being a part of it. I want to thank our access service providers, our ASL interpreters, our captioner, our CCAC production team, and mostly thank all of you for tuning in, for being a part of this, for offering your support to CCAC. And we ask you to stay tuned. We'll have a new lineup of free programming thanks to your support in 2022. And until then, we wish you a safe and healthy holiday season. And thank you for being a part of this today. Take care.
The speakers wave and smile. Fade to black. White text on black background. Open book conversation with Emily Ladau and Risa Rifkind. Presented by Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. For workshop resources and more information, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org. Presenting speakers: Clare Killy, moderator, CCAC; Emily Ladau, disability rights activist and author, Demystifying Disability; Risa Rifkind, Director of Civic Engagement and Marketing at Disability Lead. Workshop accessibility: efficiency reporting, real-time captioning; AI media, ASL interpreters; video editing, captioning, and audio description by BridgetMelton.com.